The Seattle Public Library on a Thursday afternoon in late October was exactly where Maya Torres needed to be, though not for the reasons most people might think. The 26-year-old sat at one of the long wooden tables near the children's section, her 9-month-old daughter Isabella sleeping in a worn carrier against her chest. Maya wasn't there to read. She was there because the library was warm, quiet, and free, and because the staff had stopped asking questions 3 weeks ago when she started coming every day. Her apartment building had shut off the heat 2 months earlier, citing necessary repairs that never seemed to happen. The landlord had stopped returning calls. Maya had learned to time her days around places that offered warmth without requiring purchase or explanation. The library from 9 until 5, the hospital waiting room where she cleaned offices from 6 until midnight, the 24-hour laundromat on Sunday mornings when Isabella needed a bath and their building's water was unpredictable. Maya had been a junior accountant at a mid-sized firm before Isabella was born. The pregnancy had been unexpected but not unwelcome. What had been unwelcome was the firm's quiet suggestion that perhaps she should consider her options, delivered with the kind of careful phrasing that made legal action difficult. She had tried to return after 8 weeks, but childcare cost more than her salary, and her mother, who had promised to help, had suffered a stroke that left her unable to care for herself, much less an infant. So Maya had become a night cleaner, a library regular, and an expert at making a single meal stretch across 2 days. She had also become invisible, which was mostly fine with her. Invisible meant no one asked why she was still wearing maternity clothes 4 seasons later, or why her daughter's carrier was held together with safety pins and duct tape, or why she sometimes closed her eyes during story time and let the sound of the librarian's voice wash over her like a lullaby. She was too tired to sing herself. On this particular Thursday, Maya was attempting to fill out an application for subsidized housing on one of the library's public computers when she heard the crying. It started as a whimper, then escalated into the kind of gasping, hiccuping sobs that suggested a child who had been holding something in for too long. She looked up to see a boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, standing near the biography section with tears streaming down his face. He was well dressed in the way that suggested someone else had chosen his clothes, dark slacks and a button-down shirt that seemed too formal for a library visit. His small hands were clenched into fists at his sides, and his whole body was rigid with the effort of trying to contain his distress. Maya glanced around, expecting to see a parent rushing over, but the few other people in the children's section seemed determinedly focused on their own business, the way people often do when confronted with someone else's crisis. The boy's crying grew louder, more desperate, and Maya felt something shift in her chest. She knew that sound. She had made it herself more than once in the privacy of her apartment, when Isabella was finally asleep and the weight of everything became too much to carry silently. She stood slowly, careful not to wake her daughter, and approached the boy with the same gentle caution she might use with a frightened animal. When she was a few feet away, she crouched down to his level, ignoring the way her knees protested the movement, and waited until he noticed her presence. The boy looked at her with red-rimmed eyes, his crying stuttering to a halt as confusion replaced distress. Maya spoke softly, asking if he was all right, if he was lost, if there was someone she could help him find. The boy stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head. He said he wasn't lost. He said his father was here somewhere, probably looking at business books like he always did, and that he was supposed to be looking at books about science because his father said the library was good for learning. But he didn't want to look at books about science. He wanted to go home. Except home was empty most of the time anyway, because his father was always working and his mother wasn't there anymore, and he didn't know why he was crying exactly. He just couldn't seem to stop. The confession tumbled out of him in that way children sometimes share their deepest hurts with strangers, perhaps because strangers don't have the power to make things worse. Maya listened without interrupting, without offering false comfort or easy solutions. When the boy finished, she simply asked if he would like to sit down for a minute just until he felt steadier. He nodded, and she led him to an empty reading nook near the window, settling Isabella more securely against her chest as she sat beside him. They sat in silence for a while. Maya didn't try to fill the quiet with words. She had learned that sometimes people, even very young people, just needed to exist in their pain for a moment without someone trying to fix it or explain it away. Eventually, the boy's breathing slowed, and the tension in his small frame began to ease. He looked at the sleeping baby against Maya's chest and asked how old she was. Maya told him, and they talked for a few minutes about babies and how they slept a lot, but also cried a lot, and how taking care of someone small was harder than it looked. The boy said his name was Christopher, and that he was 8 years old, and that he wished he had a little brother or sister because maybe then the house wouldn't feel so empty. Maya said she understood about empty houses, though she suspected her kind of empty was different from his. Christopher asked if she came to the library a lot, and she said she did. He said maybe he would see her again sometime, and she said maybe, though she wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. Sometimes it was better to be a stranger who witnessed a moment of pain and then disappeared, rather than someone who stayed long enough to disappoint. What Maya didn't see was the man who had been standing motionless near the end of the biography section for the past 10 minutes, close enough to hear every word of the conversation, but hidden behind a tall shelf of books. Thomas Brennan had been searching for his son with increasing panic when he'd heard the crying, and he'd arrived just in time to see a young woman in a faded jacket approach Christopher with a gentleness that made his chest tight. He had watched her crouch down despite the obvious strain it put on her body, watched her listen without judgment or platitude, watched her sit with his son in a way he himself had forgotten how to do. Thomas Brennan was 43 years old, the founder and CEO of Brennan Systems, a software company that had made him wealthy beyond anything his younger self could have imagined. He had a penthouse apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay, a garage full of cars he rarely drove, and a calendar so full of meetings and obligations that he sometimes forgot what month it was. What he didn't have was the ability to comfort his own child, a skill that seemed to have atrophied somewhere between his wife's death 3 years ago and the relentless demands of keeping a company competitive in an industry that never slept. He had brought Christopher to the library because his therapist, the fourth one they had tried, had suggested they spend more time together doing normal activities. Thomas had interpreted this as finding an educational environment where they could both occupy the same space while pursuing separate tasks, which was apparently not what the therapist had meant at all. He was beginning to understand that now, watching a stranger accomplish in 10 minutes what he had failed to do in 3 years, simply sitting with his son and acknowledging that sometimes things hurt for reasons that couldn't be immediately solved. Thomas waited until Christopher had fully composed himself and the young woman had gently suggested he should probably find his father before anyone started to worry. He watched his son nod and thank her with a politeness that was heartbreaking in its formality, then walk toward the section where Thomas was supposed to be. Only then did Thomas step out from behind the shelves, his expression carefully neutral as he greeted his son and asked if he had found any interesting books. Christopher looked up at him with those red-rimmed eyes and said no, but that he had met someone nice who had helped him feel better. Thomas glanced back toward the reading nook, but the young woman was already gone, disappeared into the library's maze of shelves and study spaces. He felt an unexpected pang of something he couldn't quite name. Regret, perhaps, or recognition, or simply the awareness that he had just witnessed something important, that he didn't fully understand. Thomas found himself returning to the library the following Thursday, telling himself it was because Christopher had asked to go back, which was true, though not the whole truth. He had spent the past week thinking about the young woman with the sleeping baby and the worn jacket, the way she had approached his son's pain with a directness and compassion that had seemed almost professional in its execution. He wanted to thank her, he told himself. It was the decent thing to do. He spotted her in the same area, this time sitting at a computer with her daughter awake and chewing on a teething ring that had seen better days. She was focused on the screen with an intensity that suggested whatever she was working on mattered deeply. Thomas hesitated, suddenly aware that approaching her might be unwelcome, that his gratitude might come across as intrusive or, worse, condescending. But Christopher had already seen her and was pulling at his hand, asking if they could say hello to the nice lady who had helped him. Maya looked up as they approached, and Thomas saw the moment of recognition, followed by something that might have been wariness. She closed the browser window quickly, a gesture that suggested she had been looking at something private, something she didn't want strangers to see. Thomas introduced himself and thanked her for her kindness to his son the previous week. Maya accepted the gratitude with a quiet nod, her attention already shifting back to her daughter, who had dropped the teething ring and was beginning to fuss. Thomas found himself offering to buy her coffee, a reflexive gesture born from years of business meetings and social conventions. Maya declined politely, but firmly, saying she was fine, that it was no trouble helping Christopher, that anyone would have done the same. Thomas knew this wasn't true, that most people had walked right past his crying child without a second glance, but he didn't press the point. Instead, he asked if she came to the library often, and she said yes, most days, and he said perhaps they would see each other again, and she said perhaps in a tone that suggested she hoped they wouldn't. But they did see each other again, the following Thursday and the one after that, until it became a pattern neither of them had explicitly agreed to, but both seemed to accept. Thomas and Christopher would arrive around 2 in the afternoon, and Maya would be there with Isabella, sometimes at the computers, sometimes in the reading nook, sometimes just sitting and watching her daughter explore the carpeted play area with the careful supervision of someone who couldn't afford for anything to go wrong. They began to have conversations, brief at first, then gradually longer. Thomas learned that Maya had worked in accounting before Isabella was born, that she was trying to find a way back into that field, but that childcare and scheduling made it nearly impossible. Maya learned that Thomas ran a software company, that Christopher's mother had died of cancer when the boy was 5, and that Thomas was struggling to be both the parent and the provider in ways that left him failing at both. The conversations were careful, each of them offering small pieces of information while holding back the larger truths. Thomas didn't mention the size of his company or the extent of his wealth. Maya didn't mention that she came to the library because it was warmer than her apartment, or that some nights she chose between buying formula and paying the electric bill. They existed in a space of partial honesty, connected by their children and their loneliness, but separated by everything else. It was Christopher who disrupted the careful balance they had established. 6 weeks after their first meeting, the boy asked Maya why she was always at the library, and she said she liked to read, which wasn't exactly a lie, but wasn't the truth either. Christopher, with the brutal honesty of children, pointed out that he never saw her with books, only computers, or just sitting. Maya felt her face flush, embarrassment and something sharper, making her voice tight as she said that sometimes people came to the library for different reasons, and that was okay too. Thomas had been standing nearby, close enough to hear the exchange, and he saw the way Maya's shoulders went rigid, the way her hand instinctively moved to touch her daughter's head as if drawing strength or comfort from the contact. He saw past the careful facade she had been maintaining, saw the exhaustion and the fear and the pride that was barely holding everything together. And he made a decision that he would later recognize as the first truly thoughtful choice he had made in years. He didn't offer money. He didn't suggest he could solve her problems. Instead, he asked if she would consider coming to work for his company, doing the books for a small subsidiary that desperately needed competent accounting help. He said he knew it was unconventional to offer someone a job in a library, but that he had been impressed by her background and her work ethic, which was evident in the way she spent her days trying to better her situation rather than simply accepting it. He said the position came with health insurance and that the company had an on-site daycare program that employees could access. Maya stared at him for a long moment, and Thomas watched as emotions flickered across her face, too quickly for him to name them all. Finally, she said she wasn't a charity case, and he said he knew that. He was offering her a job, not a handout, and there was a difference. She said it seemed too convenient, and he said maybe it was, but that didn't make it less legitimate. She asked what the salary was, and when he told her, she laughed, a short, sharp sound that had no humor in it, and said that was twice what she had been making before. Thomas said his company paid competitive wages for qualified employees, and that she was more than qualified based on her resume, which he had asked to see during one of their Thursday conversations under the pretense of offering networking advice. Maya fell silent again, and Thomas could see her working through the offer, testing it for hidden strings or unspoken expectations. He waited, letting her take the time she needed, aware that pushing would only confirm whatever suspicions she was harboring. Finally, Maya asked what he wanted from her, and Thomas understood she wasn't talking about job responsibilities. He considered his answer carefully before saying that he wanted her to accept help without feeling diminished by it, the same way she had helped his son without expecting anything in return. He said he wanted Christopher to have someone in his life who understood that sometimes people needed to cry, and that sitting with them while they did was enough. He said he wanted to stop failing at everything that mattered while succeeding at things that didn't, and that maybe working with someone who understood what actually had value would remind him how to tell the difference. The honesty seemed to startle her. This admission of need from someone who should have had everything figured out. Maya looked at Isabella, who was watching them both with solemn eyes, then back at Thomas. She said she would think about it, and he said that was fair and gave her his business card with his direct line written on the back. She took it, but didn't look at it, just slipped it into her jacket pocket and returned her attention to her daughter. Thomas didn't see Maya the following Thursday or the one after that, and he began to think he had overstepped, that his offer had been exactly the kind of presumptuous rescue fantasy she had suspected it might be. He was preparing himself for the likelihood that he had ruined whatever fragile connection they had built when his assistant informed him that someone named Maya Torres was here for an interview, and did he have time to see her? She came to his office dressed in clothes that had clearly been borrowed or purchased from a thrift store, but were clean and professional. Isabella was with her, and Thomas learned later that Maya had been too afraid to use the daycare for the interview, worried that accepting any company resource before she was officially hired would create a debt she couldn't repay. They talked for an hour about accounting systems and financial reconciliation and the specific challenges facing the subsidiary she would be working with. Thomas was impressed by her knowledge and her questions, the way she approached problems with a methodical precision that had been lacking in his company's current approach. He offered her the job and she accepted, but with conditions. She would take the standard salary for the position, not the inflated one he had mentioned. She would pay for daycare on a sliding scale based on her income, not receive it as a perk. She would be evaluated on her performance after 3 months, with both of them free to terminate the arrangement if it wasn't working. Thomas agreed to all of it, recognizing that she needed to feel like she had earned this, that it was her competence being rewarded rather than her circumstance being pitied. Maya started the following Monday, and over the weeks and months that followed, something unexpected happened. The job was real, and she was good at it. Good enough that Thomas found himself consulting her on financial decisions that extended beyond her original scope. The daycare was professional and warm, and Isabella thrived there in ways that made Maya's chest tight, with gratitude and grief for all the months her daughter had spent in makeshift arrangements. And slowly, carefully, Maya began to build a life that felt sustainable rather than desperate, a life where she could plan beyond the next week or the next bill. Thomas changed too, in ways that were harder to quantify, but no less real. Spending time with Maya, seeing how she approached problems with resilience rather than resources, reminded him that wealth was a tool, not a solution. He began leaving work earlier to spend time with Christopher, and they started having real conversations instead of parallel monologues about their respective days. He donated to causes that addressed the systemic issues Maya had navigated, not out of guilt, but out of genuine understanding of how easily circumstance could destroy even the most capable people. They never became romantically involved, which surprised some people who assumed that was the inevitable trajectory of their story. But what they built was something different and perhaps more valuable, a friendship based on mutual respect and the recognition that both of them had something the other needed. Maya needed opportunity and security. Thomas needed reminder of what mattered and why. They gave each other these things without keeping score, without expecting gratitude to transform into obligation. 2 years later, Maya was promoted to Director of Financial Operations, a position she had earned through competence and dedication that had nothing to do with how they had met. She had an apartment with reliable heat, a savings account, and a daughter who was healthy and happy. Thomas had a son who smiled more and cried less, and a company that had begun implementing policies around parental leave and childcare support that made it easier for employees at all levels to maintain both careers and families. On Thursdays, they still sometimes met at the library, not because they needed to, but because they wanted to, because it reminded them both of a moment when two people had recognized each other's humanity across a divide that should have been uncrossable. Christopher and Isabella would play in the children's section while Maya and Thomas sat nearby, sometimes talking, sometimes just existing in comfortable silence. Two people who had learned that kindness didn't require wealth, and that wealth without kindness was just numbers in an account. If you ever find yourself sitting in a library on a Thursday afternoon and see someone who looks like they're carrying more than they can manage, maybe take a moment to really see them. You never know what small gesture of recognition might change everything, for them or for you.